Hi, everyone. Emily Sullivan here, and I'm here with, you can introduce yourself, Derek.
Derek Bardowell, CEO of 10 Years Time, and really pleased to be here.
Great. So we're trying out a new format for the participatory grant making community today. We're going to do a recorded chat. The idea is that we didn't want to bring you together for a live event at this time, since we're hopeful that you're busy probably doing one of two things. Either you're actively fundraising because we've got a week to Giving Tuesday and it's giving season, and you're a community-based funder or you're a community-based organization, and we're hoping you're getting some good success in your fundraising. Or you might be one of the more traditional funder members of the PGM community, and we're hoping you're going to use your underspend for the year to support some of those community-based funders. And Derek and I are going to plug some of them at the end if you are in a position to give. So yeah, we're gonna chat a little bit here today about this quote unquote giving season, and maybe what we're hoping those of you who are more in the traditional philanthropy category should be thinking and doing differently. And then we're gonna talk amongst those who are actively community-based funders, participatory grant makers, to see, how we can utilize our collective power here. So that's the idea. But before we jump in, Kieran, who runs our open houses monthly for the PGM community, she always likes to start off with asking people like how they are as a human, how you are as Derek, as Emily, and how I'm doing it. So Derek, anything nice that's happened this morning to you that was a good start to your day? Good cup of coffee, fresh air, looks like you got some sunshine. What's Derek's life this morning that went pretty well?
I got some sunshine. So annoyingly, I've been doing my best to try and stop some level of this sun coming in, but I'm blessed also because it's a rare thing in England. So yeah, happy that it's sunny. What about yourself?
Yeah. Similarly here, I'm in Basel, Switzerland. It's a sunny day, and a good start to my day was I had a chat with my oldest childhood friend this morning. So it was a really nice way to start my day. So
nice.
So yeah, that's me and Derek as humans who are a part of this PGM community. And we're going to attempt to talk to sort of roughly the two categories-ish of PGMers who are a part of this now 1,000-member community across 78 countries. So maybe just to get us all on the same page, since that can be a little bit of a challenge, as an understatement there. This giving season, we've seen kind of a strange dynamic coming up where there's in the media an ever ongoing reckoning of sort of big philanthropy, sort of a takedown of the concept, and naming and shaming, millionaires and billionaires giving away money based on their own interests. But also the giving guides and the charity navigators and everything else that are coming into people's inboxes are still using these effective altruism models, this sort of formulaic way of giving. So Derek, as also an author of a new book, Giving Back, How to Give Back Better, what is sort of the fundamental misunderstanding that we need to sort of put forward here at the top of our chat today? What is the fundamental misunderstanding about giving well versus giving back, generosity, justice? What is the fundamental bit here that we need to point out?
I think for me, it's that and when I say we, I mean the charity, philanthropic, the general public view philanthropy through a lens of an institutional practice. And what I mean by that is we have these foundations, very wealthy people that essentially have created a bunch of mechanisms through which we perceive giving to be good. So application forms, 3-year grant cycles, reporting mechanisms, with specific types of language and specific types of questioning, which is more around financial preservation and stewardship than it is around effectiveness of your grant giving. So you've got all of these institutional practices, which is really perceived as the mechanism through which money is given away in a very good way, and that's preserved since God knows how many years. And I guess the fundamental thing that you're trying to change here is really moving it from an institutional practice to a cultural practice. And the cultural practice is where communities across the globe, indigenous communities, Black and brown communities, working class communities, have for years practiced elements of philanthropy that has been based on risk and reward being shared, and being able to survive based on how they have been exploited by wealthy people traditionally. So for me, the fundamental change here is where we move from valuing those cultural practices and that being the key mechanism and the way that we message how effective philanthropy should be done, as opposed to these institutional practices that have really been created to preserve and look after wealthy people's money.
Right, and that there's an assumption that this status quo is quote unquote working, which there's not a terrible amount of evidence.
No.
Yeah, right.
Well, there's no accountability. So I always think back to, years ago, there was, colleagues of mine and others who were advocating for, climate change and climate justice at a point where there was lots of people that were sitting on these boards that didn't believe climate change existed. Or, if I go back and think about, participatory grant making and the EDGE Fund and how innovative they were and still are, but how they were very much viewed as a threat back in the day, or people were not getting behind it because it was a threat to these institutional practices. And that's the problem. The big problem is that there's no accountability to those that didn't make those decisions or rejected it at the time. So as much as they can turn around and say, oh, we helped 5,000 kids with our grant making and all of that sort of stuff, we have no accountability around the decisions that they didn't make, but also just the way that their wealth, which is for most foundations 95% of their business, has been creating harm to the climate, to BIPOC communities, etc. So that's part of it, and that's part of the institution as well. That's part of the institution practice, is that when you sit on that mountaintop or in the trustees board, the level of accountability to communities is absolutely minimal.
Yeah, exactly. So for those who have recently joined the PGM community, who are just starting to really understand some of what you're talking about, I mentioned to you before that I think sometimes people can refer to that sort of work as like, oh, well, that's sort of cute, or like trying to move things within a family foundation, or that this isn't enough of a seismic change, that you're sort of wasting your time trying to change people's mindsets and hearts and fundamental understanding really about the way the world works. For those who are here and are trying to be hopeful that it is worth their time to make this, do you have maybe a little bit of a reflection on that, okay, you might not be EDGE funders, you might not be a community-based fund, but you're trying to, at a minimum, shake up, maybe reimagine, unlikely dismantle, but you're somewhere here. Is it worth it? Are those who are here, fooling themselves that this is a way to create change, or is this a worthwhile, path?
So I'll always say it's a worthwhile path, but that's partially because I come from a background of delivering projects. And, you know, when I used to work with young people and young offenders institutes, I used to work in prison, work on various estates and stuff like that. You always had belief in that young person that they could mobilize their way out of the situation. You had to have that belief in them. Now, I don't think there are enough people that have that level of belief that work in foundations. I think that's one of the problems, because actually, if there was an even bigger community of people on boards who had that belief in humanity, had that belief that, you know, those that have been marginalized by society can succeed, then I think it's really important to have that in your mind, because you're damn sure that there's no one that's been in an oppressed situation that have thought we can't do it. And it always springs to mind for me Yvonne Field, who is the founder of the Ubele Initiative. She was part of the anti-apartheid movement. And then one of the things that I remember her saying to me was there wasn't a point where any of the people she was working with thought that they all thought they would succeed. They thought they would win. And that was really, really important. Whether they were going to be there for that victory, right? They didn't know, but they always thought they were going to win. The other thing that springs to mind was I was at the Pathways Fund launch last week, which is being done by Voice for Change and TSIC and Stephen Bediako. And Daniel Sattar did the keynote speech for it. And I've known Daniel for, you know, a long time, because we worked at Esme Fairbairn. And he was talking about the social investment sector, and he's been around philanthropy for many years, and he said it didn't exist 25 years ago. Social investment didn't exist. Now it's absolutely, you know, propelling. It's going really far. It's now a credible alternative towards grant making. That's, you know, and he was talking about all of the growth that there is in social investment at the moment. But I just really loved the way that he framed it, because he talked about what happened and what was needed and required to get there. But he just gave some perspective to say, okay, we've got to look towards the future. Right. And even though we want more of the foundations to act with greater urgency, we absolutely do, and they're not doing their part around this. They do need to act more urgent, so it's not letting them off the hook. There is also a long game here to say that what's being created now, and what's been created over the last 5, 6, 7 years, with everything from the participatory grant making movement and the stuff that you guys are doing, some of the funds that are being developed across the globe, from the Black Feminist Fund to Project Tallower and others, to some of the other developments in terms of the literature that's coming out that's being critical of philanthropy or exposing it, to the community groups that are doing some systems change work that's now starting to be exposed and becoming a bit harder to erase, you know, in the ways that they have been traditionally. All of this is part of a really massive movement of change. And as I said, the frustration is that it's not happening with the level of urgency that's required. But the thing that I always say is the long game here is whether you're working at a small foundation making that change, because if you're working at that small foundation and they do things drastically differently, then their ability to speak to their peers or to their next generation is really huge. And they'll be able to speak to their peers in a way that I wouldn't be able to speak to them or others. It's that thing that says whatever we're doing now and whatever's happening now is starting to solidify what's going to happen in the future. And it's also going to produce more people, more like-minded people and change makers that are going into foundations, as well as more funds that are happening outside of it.
Right. So if you're feeling like, oh, this is a fringe movement, and no, there is a groundswell here, and that being able to recognize that as like a powerful force that is building, like you mentioned, it has been around for a long time. Indigenous communities, Black and Brown communities around the world have used this participatory way of caring for one another for pretty much all of time. So yes, it's always been there, but no, this isn't just fringe, small, you know, only a handful of community-based funders at this point doing this differently. is a genuine groundswell, and it's can only be ignored for so much longer.
And I would always say this, like when the Caribbean community came over to England, you know, en masse, been here for years and years, but en masse after the Second World War, you know, and we couldn't get money from the banks, couldn't get credit, you know, we had a thing called the partner system, which was, you know, giving circles that just enabled people to be able to pool their money together and give it to an individual to enable them to, you know, put food on their table and things like that. The very, very first credit union in the UK was from the Caribbean community, and that the credit union movement, which now has, I don't know, probably 400 plus credit unions and God knows how many millions of people using it, was something that has evolved over the last 50 or 60 years and has been an incredible game-changing thing for many communities on the ground. And again, you know, it's not just the Caribbean communities, there are plenty of other communities that have been doing that. But again, from those, I think it was 10 people that started that in Hornsey in London, to what it is now. They probably couldn't have conceived it would be as big as it has become. But I think that's something to always bear in mind, that these are not fringe things, because there are communities across the globe that are thinking the same. How you mobilize them or mass mobilize them to make those change, I think that's an interesting concept and next stage for the type of work that we're all involved in.
Yeah, I think what I'm sort of hearing what you're saying between the lines is, you know, yes, have the humility to know that it might not be in your lifetime, or even, or that these, you know, fundamental dismantling and rebuilding of systems, it might not be a part of your lifetime, but that doesn't mean that that this movement isn't real, and that, you know, the contribution as an individual, as a smaller fund, as a community-based fund, isn't a part of something. You know, I think as human beings, we want to be a part of something bigger than ourselves anyway. So there's an appeal to that.
But I think that's part of, and I tried to do this in my book, because I think I interviewed Imi Kaur from Civic Square in Birmingham, and one of the things that she said to me was, how do you as a community connect everyone's work that they're doing to something that is a bigger vision, that is a bigger, broader vision? I'm paraphrasing it. She didn't say those exact words, but what she was saying with her work in Birmingham was, what we try to do is we're creating this kind of mass movement, this more regenerative and circular community with the work that we're doing, but we're also ensuring that every person, whether they're doing childcare over in this corner here, or whether they're doing some other part, you know, local food mechanisms, that it's building into something that is a bigger picture. And I think that's what you guys are doing with your community, is that bit around, you know, when you're doing work in your community locally and you're on your own, or, you know, you don't have something that's wider, that doesn't fit into a bigger or broader vision, or not know that, you know, it can be hard and it can be really tough. So that thing around the bigger and broader vision, what you're contributing to that, the movement, I think is really absolutely fundamental.
But then the message here for those of you who are maybe hanging on by a thread, thinking at the end of the year, looking for energy, like, yeah, don't give up here. But I think what you're also getting at is a little bit of a challenge that, you know, those who are fundraising, especially this giving season, have, and we may have even lost some people in the conversation up till this point, is people they understand things like effective altruism, or they understand concepts of giving well, you know, select high burden of disease, add on a low cost intervention, and bam, you've got a good investment portfolio. You know, people who are now, even if the general public, like your aunts and uncles, might just use whatever kind of giving guide goes into their inbox. Maybe there's an opening here for you know, a way of making it easier for people to collect, using the power of this collective, like you're saying, make it easier for people to figure out where to give. You know, we're gonna, you've been mentioning a couple of organizations, and at the PGM community, we highlight the work of Camden Giving and Disability Rights Fund, and you know, and many others. We will be sure to add on more at the end and in the links under this, but there isn't really, we got a little bit of a comms problem. You know, we talked about this, that a lot of community-based funds don't have a big comms shop. We don't have a kind of simple phrasing. You know, there's been a pushback against doing that, even because it can be perceived as cheapening the real digging and unearthing and dismantling that's necessary. But at the same time, it's then saying, okay, unless you're doing this, then you're not doing enough. And so what do you think collectively, now that there is more of this community, like the participatory grant making community and others, is there something we should be doing differently? You know, it might be a little late this giving season, other than plugging a few here, but, you know, set our sights on 2023 for, you know, there's an opening here maybe to be really making it easier, like the effective altruism folks have, for people to understand what this really is and how they can actually just give now differently. I don't know, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's so we do have a comms issue, and it's I always like to say Amazon versus the local bookshop. You know, at the end of the day, Amazon is mass marketed. It makes it super easy to be able to do what it does. But then, you know, when you go to a local bookshop, not only do you get some level of community from that, but also you're contributing to your local community in terms of, you know, putting it into that organization. You also get, you know, tons of other things from that. How you value that, I think, is really important. And I think, and we saw this a bit through COVID, people started to value that a bit more than they had done, because they just had more time to do things, as opposed to having to rush and make purchases and stuff like that. But, you know, look, we're getting to a point where things are going to get a bit uncomfortable for people, because I always say that, you know, I think it's absolutely right that us who might be considered, I don't know, progressive, of lived experience in the way that we do things and background, whatever it might deem it, you know, we scrutinize, and rightfully so, because we want things to be right. We want to ensure that things are authentic, that people are given credit where credit is due, that we are not taking a very simplistic view of philanthropy in the way that we do things. And I think that's absolutely right. The challenge is that how you communicate that outside of our circle becomes really, really difficult. And you know, I was, you know, with talking to a parent the other day, you know, one of my son's friends, parent, and I was saying what I do, and I was saying I do philanthropy education, philanthropy advice. And as with most people, it was like, what the hell is that? And gave me that look. But they said, what? Effective altruism. And I was like, oh,
you know that one.
How do you know that? How do you know that? Before the concern about him knowing that, it was just the fact that he had some conception of that. And when I have conversations with other people, what they will bring up is they'll bring up Marcus Rashford, or, you know, Giving Pledge will come up and stuff like that. So part of it, or Mackenzie Scott, you know, so part of it is, you know, how do we authentically simplify the messaging of some of this, which might not sit well with people, but ultimately it's partially around, you know, it's like the best music, right? Like the best music can do really authentic stuff, right? And be absolutely beautiful, but in being palatable as well. you know. So if I look at, I don't know, Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder, right, what you have is the ultimate album that is pop and popular, but with really deep, meaningful messages, as well as being artistically brilliant. So you don't need to have, it doesn't need to be one or the other, right? It's more around how do you start. I'm not saying that your community are all a bunch of Stevie Wonders and stuff like that, but how do you create your songs in the key of life? And how do you essentially try to message that out in an effective way that enables people, if someone says, I do participatory grant making, or I do this, I'll do that, immediately they can click and say, oh, that's that, and they can link to that. And yeah, I think that's difficult to create that messaging, and it takes some consensus and stuff like that, but I think it's absolutely key, because as I said, you can write as much as you want or do as much of this great work as you want, but part of it is, if we're to mobilize on a mass level, particularly that level of wealth, then finding effective messaging to different communities that might not be as like-minded as us is also going to be a key to that. And I think if there is one thing that you might do next year, it's how you do that next year. Is how do you find that authentic thing? You know, I always come back to, I think it's Jane Mayer's Dark Money, and she was talking about all of the, you know, stuff that all of those billionaires in America had done to influence, you know, voting and everything like that. And at the end of the day, it was what, 4 or 5 things that they were really funding, right? So deregulation, tax breaks, cuts to social services, you know, and minimizing government intervention in their ability to earn profits, you know. And I'm sure there was other things, and I'm oversimplifying it, but essentially they plowed, you know, tons of money into 4 or 5 areas, whether it worked or not. But part of it was, this is quite simple, for us to gain more profits and for us to not have high levels of accountability in how we're gaining these profits, right? These are the 4 or 5 things that we need to fund. So what is the messaging that becomes compelling for those outside of your community to say, this is the right way of doing it, instead of the institutional practice of philanthropy?
Right, and I heard you when you're mentioning just now about these, you know, in order to justify this way of giving back, giving differently, giving, you know, with a restorative lens, with we're developing all these frameworks and justifications and scorecards and everything else to say this is or isn't community led, or this is what participatory looks like, or this is what, and it's because there's a systems change element to it, and you're trying to convince people to come along. But at the same time, it's a little bit of the undoing. You know, if you look at these painfully simple charity navigators and things, they literally use, like, you know, cost effectiveness formulas to determine something, and who's determining effectiveness is obviously a key part of the problem. But their simple messaging has made it easy for people who want to give but don't want to think much about it to give significant amounts of money. And the reality is that if that's something that this broader community wants to do, to redistribute wealth, decolonize wealth, then do we need to take a page out of their book? And like what I'm hearing you say is, yes, there may be a risk of, you know, being perceived as cheapening the message, but you have to try to find a way of doing it authentically, while also not making it seem like, oh, you know, this new way of giving resources is going to save the world. There's an in-between here. There's an authentic way.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be an either or, you know, and I think that thing where we will get into arguments that becomes the either or becomes really unhelpful, in the sense that, you know, as I said, what is the bigger picture here? The bigger picture is we want to move money to communities. We want to get more money to communities that don't get it. And we know that as an institutional practice, you know, racially minoritized led organizations, you know, gender in the environment, women's groups and environment get very minimal money. Black feminist organizations get minimal money. Community organizing gets minimal money. Root cause work gets minimal. Statistically, we absolutely know that as an institutional practice, communities that are marginalized by society do not get as much money. So for me, the argument for why the current systems don't work, they're already there. And fortunately, we've started to get a bit more data that's enabled us to really be able to understand that and establish that. I think the bit where you say, okay, if that's what's wrong, here's what's right, and being pro around what you guys want to do in your community in terms of spreading the word. But as I said, spreading a word, but also spreading a vision. I think that's fundamental, because I think that then has a knock-on effect on so many different areas of this sector. You know, I was watching an advert the other day from a charity that I won't name, and again, it was more poverty porn that was put on television and stuff. And then in my head, I was just like, my God, someone's going to do an advert that's going to reevaluate that and just say, and the advert, which might be 2 minutes, somewhere in that 2 minutes, they're going to talk about the colonial history of that country and what Britain had done to that country and what the root causes of it are. And then it will pan into like communities that are doing some fabulous work there. At some point, that will be what that image will be. That's what it will be. And some of this is going to be around people taking those risks and creating those images and visions so people can see an alternative. And then suddenly people's mindset changes from crisis and guilt response, which is often so much of the giving model for so many people. It's a crisis, or I feel guilty, towards something that is a bit more proactive and visionary.
Right. All right. Well, I think what's interesting about the opportunity of some of these, like, you know, I've heard you mention before, that unless you're sort of in these circles, you don't necessarily know the names of some of these, you know, they're not, some of these smaller funds, they're not having adverts on the television, they're not, you know, popping up as ads on your Facebook page or whatever else, but that, you know, there is power in the collective. So what I'm really hearing you encourage all of us members of the PGM community and broader is that likely very few of us are going to have the communications budget individually to run something like that kind of an advertisement, or to really try to change the scale of the conversation, or while making it still authentic, but that this is really is worth doing, because for too long the messaging around, you know, this parent at your son's school knows about this effective altruism for whatever reason, and that's resonating or working with people, but there is it is worth it, like you mentioned that it is worth it to give this a real collective effort in trying to
look, we're just about to experience the biggest or the greatest wealth transfer in history. So there'll be a next gen of wealth holders that will want to do things differently. They think differently to their parents or their grandparents. They might not quite be yet in control of that wealth, but there is a great opportunity to really start redefining what philanthropy really looks like. And you've got, you know, organizations like Good Ancestors Movement, where, you know, they're talking more around not just the philanthropic side, but their wealth accumulation, their investments, and, you know, 30 Percy as well, their spiral investment policy as well, where you're starting to see people not divorce. The Heron Foundation in the States, who've been doing this historically for many years, who are looking at ways in which you're saying, okay, look, let's not keep it to this 3, 4, or 5% of funding. Let's look at your whole funds and making sure that everything is aligned to the mission that you are publicly saying. And that is in and of itself is going to release significant amounts of money into this system, because I think it does require new money. That part of it, I don't have any doubt that's going to happen at some point, because because it's happening already. It's already changing how we get into those conversations, how we communicate and message out. So in 10 years time, when someone else's kid talks about, you know, a parent is talking about being a philanthropy advisor, and they turn around and say, oh, participatory grant making instead of effective altruism, or they say something else and stuff. You have to believe that that's going to happen. And I think the opportunity to be able to move resources into communities that really need it requires huge levels of patience, well-being and care on the part of people that are trying to mobilize money into the communities. But it's also worth doing, and it's, as I said, it needs to be done collectively, because, you know, at the end of the day, mass mobilization is the thing that creates that social change. Why can't there be a similar type of movement? And it's not just the participatory grant making movement, there are other movements in grant making. Why can that not be the thing that really catalyzes significant levels of change in the way, in the practices and how things are done? I haven't seen it yet, but there is so many different groups that are popping up. I'm like encouraged to see that. I think, you know, it can happen on a global scale.
Right. Okay, well, that is a good giving season message, I think. And if people are interested in maybe continuing this conversation, maybe having a follow-up where we could dig in and think about, like, what would that practically look like? I think we could invite people at a minimum. There's our very active Slack channel. So if you want to follow up with us there, that's one possibility. Of course, you can always email the community. I think this is worth really digging into. I know there's been a lot of hesitation or concern about cheapening that message of what this means, but I also think that I trust in the broader community even coming together to say, okay, how do we do this with authenticity in a way that, so that in the future, when Derek's on the playground with his kids and the parents, that they don't have to ask him what does he mean by this and make an assumption about some other thing. So yeah, let's maybe continue this conversation more beyond just me and Derek here about what is the power of the collective, maybe to make it so that this time next year, there's a clearer way to be shifting how people are giving at an even bigger scale than is already happening. Any other, some more plugs you want to do? I know we don't have a giving guide to slap in the chat, but maybe a couple extra plugs you want to, Sister Cut,
Sisters Uncut, and I think Avia Day, who is part of Sisters Uncut, has just put out a book called, I think, Abolition Revolution. I can't remember, but I think it just came out literally in the last week or two. I think that's worth definitely checking out. And yeah, as I said, a huge advocate for people like Baobab Foundation, Pathways Fund, Project Talawa, and others that are doing some fantastic, you know, sort of work in terms of redistributing wealth. So yeah, that's me. And yeah, and giving back. Check it out. As I said, it's about reimagining philanthropy through a reparative lens. So very, very relevant to how we redistribute resources, rebalance power, and repair harm.
Excellent. Thank you, Derek, for your time and for your inspiration. This our recorded chat, and we look forward to continuing on and hopefully building that movement that you're talking about.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emily.
Yep. Have a good day, everyone.